It's very difficult to sum up the history of this country, which is larger than Europe. It's a continent, and it goes back 10,000 years BC. I've seen paintings, cave paintings in central India, which have been dated at more than 10,000 BC. They are still intact. You have the same kind of drawings on the rocks in color, some of them, showing men at war, men hunting elephants, men hunting rhinoceros. You don't see any horses in this, so you know that these things were done before horses were trained to join the battle. But thereafter, from even before the Buddhist period, about 5000 BC, you start getting monuments spread all over the country with rock edicts and writing an old Pali script, which is now being deciphered. With the Buddhists, you get many more viharas, temples, relics of Buddha, the life of Buddha. Then when Buddhism was ousted of the country and Hinduism came back into its own, you get a whole variety of temples depicting the themes of Hindu mythology. A remarkable thing about is that we have many temples, particularly in the east and south, where the temple walls are decorated with the most explicit statuary of men and women engaged in sex, because life according to Hindu theology was divided in four periods: childhood, adulthood, old age, and then sannyas, leaving the world and living in the forest. And the second aspect was always shown as a man with a wife, man with lady friends, and since sex was an integral part of that period of life, these sculptures in temples like Khajuraho in Konark, people come and say, how on earth can these people have these sexual scenes on walls of temples? Well, they have to be explained, because Indian society in those times was not as inhibited, as shy of sex as we are today. Thereafter, you come to Muslim monuments. They started invading India about 12th century AD, and for many centuries ruled the country. They built beautiful palaces, mosques, mausoleums, of which the most outstanding is the Taj Mahal, built in the 16th, 17th century. Is the most spectacular monument that anyone can see anywhere in the world, made of beautiful white marble. The Mughal legacy is probably the richest that India has of Muslim times. We have the world's largest mosque, one of them in Delhi. We have some of the most beautiful tombs of kings and queens now scattered all over northern India. After the Mughal period, we come to the British. They have also left a very valuable legacy. One attempt to make a building more beautiful than Taj was made in Calcutta. It's still there, but nowhere near. It became kind of a joke, the imitation Taj. But their greatest contribution is the building of the city where I'm sitting now, New Delhi. It was started after World War I, and it is one of the most magnificent capitals you can see anywhere, because not only has it got very big buildings made of red and yellow sandstone, it has the largest avenues, and the British had this sense of nature and preservation. It's one of the greenest capitals in the world. There are more trees per square kilometer in New Delhi than any other capital in the world. So we have this very beautiful capital now, which is being used by the modern independent government for parades and exhibitions. So altogether, you get a spectrum of the history of the world. Even in a place like Delhi, if you go to the old Purana Kila, as we call it, you will see relics of pieces of pottery, artifacts, jewelry, which have been dated well over 4 or 5,000 BC, and you have the modern city of New Delhi, and it's expanding. It's going on and on. You see the latest styles of architecture, all available in this one city.
How do you see the future of India?
You know, India is a great country for astrologers. They try and forecast the future by the movement of the stars. I'm not an astrologer. I won't try to forecast the future, but we have launched on an incredible experiment of a country which is at the same time so backward, so poor, so illiterate, and we've given all citizens equal rights in the way of voting. The experiment in democracy. Women who have been treated like slaves for centuries and generations are even now maltreated, have the same right to vote, and in fact do vote more than the men in our elections. We've had several general elections. We've had democratic governments ever since independence. That's more than 50 years now. And governments have changed. We have never had violent overthrow one government by another. It's always been outvoted. And today we are facing this situation of unstable governments because there are too many parties and one government is replaced by another. But nobody can tamper with our democracy now. An attempt was made by Mrs. Gandhi to abolish democratic rule, and she paid the price by being outvoted next time, and it became the black period in Indian democratic history. Today we have the same situation of unstable governments, and yet nobody will dare talk of a dictatorial rule in this country.
Would you speak about the great souls of India, like Rabindranath Tagore or Mahatma Gandhi, Jawaharlal Nehru?
They are great people. If we talk only of the British period, the British really took over the country roughly around 1800. They had become rulers of almost the entire country. We've had many Renaissance movements. To start with, we were so totally dominated by the British that they convinced us that we had nothing to be proud of. Our literature, our religion, everything was nearly savage, and they created a picture of India largely of tigers and snakes and elephants and backward people with horrible practices like burning widows and worshipping animals. The reaction began immediately after the British took over, and we had people like Ram Mohan Roy who tried to translate Indian classics into English languages. And there were many English people who themselves realized when they read the Vedas, the Bhagavad Gita, and realized that there was much more to Indian religions than just worship of rivers and snakes and trees. And the appreciation started, and then it picked up. They didn't know what Indian dancing was. They only saw nautch girls in brothels, which they thought was Indian culture and dancing. And suddenly up came people like Uday Shankar reviving Indian classical ballet. And now we have 5 or 6 schools of Indian dancing, the most popular being the Bharatnatyam from the south. You have the Odissi, you have the Kuchipudi, you have the Manipuri, you have the Kathak in northern India, and all of them are evolving. There is, in fact, a renaissance of old Indian culture in its best aspects. It also applies to literature. Tagore was not the only person. Tagore gave Bengali language a boost which it very badly wanted. There were people before him, Bengali writers, novelists, and many more after him, good poets and good novelists. And therefore the tradition in Bengal continues. Of all the states of the Indian Union, Bengal produces probably the best literature so far. The others states are coming up too. But what is remarkable, that with merely about 200 years of British rule and the imposition of English on the Indian elite, uh, everyone thought that English would be abolished and Indian languages take their place. Now that hasn't happened. The attempt to impose Hindi has failed. We have 16 regional languages spoken by millions of people, each one of them. The best writing today in India is being done by Indians writing in the English language. Many of them won great recognition abroad. Tagore himself is known for his translations from Bengali into English. In recent times, we've had Mr. Nirad Chaudhary, who's now 100 years old, living in England. His style of writing English has been applauded by English critics as the most chaste and pure. In recent years, we've had novelists like Salman Rushdie, who's under a sentence of death from Tehran, an extremely powerful writer. We've got Vikram Seth, young man, only in his 30s or 40s, whose novel, A Suitable Boy, won him millions of dollars in advance royalties. And now recently we've got a young girl, she's in her 30s, Arundhati Roy, whose first novel, The God of Small Things, has already fetched her over $1 million in advance royalties. And this continues. We are throwing up younger and much better writers than writers of my generation.
You are also an eminent writer of India. Could you please talk us about your writer career?
Well, I was really trained to be a lawyer. My father sent me to England to study law, and then I came back and set up practice in Lahore, which is now in Pakistan. I didn't do too well as a lawyer. I didn't have much of a practice, but I started writing stories based on the cases that I was handling in the law courts, because I was mainly a criminal lawyer, and there were so many human aspects to every criminal case. It was after partition, when I was thrown out of Lahore, being a Sikh. Pakistan became a purely Muslim country, and I was posted abroad. I got a job in the external affairs. I was posted abroad in England, then in Canada, then back in England. That these very stories I had written in my lawyer days got published in England, and they got good reviews. They didn't get many sales. And then I worked on my first novel called Train to Pakistan, which tells the tragedy of the partition of the country and the horrible massacres that took place. 10 million people changed hands within 3 or 4 months with horrible killings. And I thought this was too big a theme to be left alone, so I wrote this novel, Train to Pakistan, which has now been filmed and will be released on the 15th of August, India's independence, 50th Indian independence anniversary. Thereafter, I have not had to look back. I've done many jobs, small jobs for the government. I've taught in the States, and I've been editing papers like the Illustrated Weekly of India, which is dead now, the Hindustan Times. I then became a freelance columnist, and I make a good living out of writing, which is a rare phenomena in any country. People say you can't live by writing alone. I'm not the only one who lives entirely by writing. I live very well by writing. I'm in my 80s now. I have over 80 books to my credit, and my columns appear not only in English language papers but in all Indian language papers, and I get royalties or fees from all of them. So I can say quite confidently that the Indian writer has never had it as good as he's having today.
You have a very special sense of humor. What does it mean for you, the humor?
Well, life is so grim that unless you develop a sense of humor, you can't take it. Whenever the worst tragedy takes place, you can either start beating your breast and crying, or you can see the funny side of it. And I find that far more useful to be at peace with myself. Like all other countries, we have politicians who are full of their own importance, full of ego. They'll preach big sermons on being honest and clean, and you find later on that they are the worst and the most corrupt. Now you can lose your temper with them, or you can make fun of them. And I find making fun of them the easiest way to deflate them. I keep telling my fellow writers and journalists that if you want to burst a balloon, a pin is more effective than a hammer. So if you want to really burst a politician's reputation when you know he doesn't deserve it, just make fun of him. And he'll never forgive you because he becomes a laughing stock in the country.
In the Indo-Hungarian contact and tradition, there is a very great name of Amrita Sher here. Would you speak kindly about her?
Well, I had the privilege of knowing Amrita Sher personally. She took a house just across where I was living in Lahore. She'd married her own Hungarian cousin, who was a doctor, and they settled there. She came to see me in connection with small things like plumbers and washermen, and where to buy fish and meat and what to do, because she was a newcomer to Lahore. She was a remarkably attractive woman, being half Sikh, half Hungarian. And her first exhibition in Lahore created quite a storm. There were many people who acclaimed her as the greatest artist in India. She was only 30 at the time. And oddly enough, the man who really built her up was another Hungarian called Charles Fabry, and then followed by a Parsi called Karl Khandalawala. There were many people who did not agree with that verdict. Now, she was very outspoken and way ahead of the times. She was very promiscuous. She had many gentlemen friends, and so many myths and legends were built on her appetite for sex and men's company. Unfortunately, I think that was the last year of her life. Nobody knows still in what circumstances she died. But her cousin, SIKH, who had come to stay with her, came over to my flat at Lahore and said, could he spend the night there? Because Amrita was very ill and was not expected to last. And she died that night. And I was amongst the 5 or 6 people who attended her funeral. So I have very pleasant memories of this woman. I'm looking forward to knowing her better, but she didn't last long enough for me to know her better.
How would you describe the soul of India or the spirit of India?
Well, it's very elusive, and I think it's something which interests the European much more than it interests ourselves. I'm mystified at the thousands of Europeans who come to India looking for what they call the truth. I don't know what the word means. What do you mean by looking at the truth or finding the truth? They go to ashrams, they spend months meditating there, they are instructed by the gurus, they practice yoga, and they chant hymns from the Sanskrit, and they seem strangely at peace with themselves. I go to the same places, and I am just amused to see what people are doing. When people ask me what India means to you, to me, I can always mention one incident which I see all the time. I go once a year to Hardwar, which is about 150 miles from Delhi, where the river Ganga enters the plains. It comes at a great speed. It's a very beautiful river, sparkling blue waters and tumbling over rocks and moving at great speed at Hardwar. Thereafter it becomes very sluggish and dirty. Up to Hardwar it's very clean. And every night at sunset they have a ceremony of worship of the Ganga, worship of the river. And suddenly as the sun goes down, all along the banks, all the temples, their bells start clanging, and priests come out with big chandelier type lamps with 100 lamps on each burning, and they chant, wave these lamps over the river, touching its surface and chanting. This lasts barely 5 minutes, and people float little boats with oil lamps in them. The boats go floating down the river at great speed. It is a totally pagan scene. It has nothing to do with any religion. It's connected with the worship of nature, the worship of rivers at its best. And I see this, it haunts me for the rest of the year. And that's what India means to me, is the worship of the Ganga.
May I ask you that what do you know about Hungary, the Hungarians?
Very little except the Magyars. We were told that they're most beautiful people in Europe, the most outgoing, and then we had these Hungarians here, some artists, including the half Hungarian Amrita Sher. We read her books, and thereafter the only things I know are legends, like how Tokay is very good for your sex problem. It's an aphrodisiac. That the Hungarians are more outgoing than other Europeans, and that perhaps some of us, our ancestors, came from Hungary, particularly our gypsy population here, which is considerable. Their words and vocabulary, I'm told, has much in common with the Hungarian. So it's all a jumbled up notion of what we have. I can't really say much more about Hungary.
I am a regular watcher of your television program at Durdanshan. I like it very much, your interviews. Could you speak about that work, what you are doing for Durdanshan?
I don't really do any work for television. I don't like appearing on television. But I have become a kind of notorious character, so when anything happens, they descend on my apartment and ask my views on anything. Change of government, any tragedy or something. Now we had a new Prime Minister yesterday. I happen to know him reasonably well. I've known him many years. The first thing they said, we want you to say something about the Prime Minister which you know, and it should be very witty. I said, now, if you make jokes about the new Prime Minister, it won't bring him up create an image that he should have. But that's what they ask me to do all the time. I appear for the BBC, I appear for the Voice of America and the German TV and all. But I'm not a TV person. I've just been dragged into it, and I do it now under great protest.
President Weizmann of Israel visited India, and he made a comment that the 21st century is for the East and China. How do you judge this?
Well, it's very flattering. So far, it seems that China has stolen a march over us. The rate of progress is much faster than ours. We try and console ourselves that they are a dictatorship, there are no human rights there, and we are taking much longer because we are going in a democratic way. That ultimately we will win the race. It is the race between a tortoise and a hare, and they may have shot ahead of us right now, but ultimately the slow and steady progress of the tortoise, which is India, will win the race, and we will outdo other countries in Asia in industrial development as well.
I experienced that India is a country which could keep its tradition, its heritage even today. I think this is one of the importance of India, that even today's India is very similar of the old India. How do you feel this?
Well, I'm an agnostic. I don't believe in many things that my fellow countrymen believe. The Indian traditions are largely religious. I disapprove of religious traditions and religious ritual. Yet I feel that what holds the country together is this common respect for religions. And I think if we lose that and totally follow the Western path, we'll have lost some of our great heritage.
Thank you very much for your thank you.
You get all the bird noises, crows. As Lakshmi, because Lakshmi was also the name of his mother, my grandmother. And so he especially had that.
This is a very nice garden.
Yeah. He had the best rose garden in Delhi. That part. With all roses. Mr. Jinnah used to walk across from that house to look at his roses. Gandhi used to come from there, from the Péter Birla house. But it's odd that the hollyhock is the same. My father had the same hollyhock here. And during the war, he had an underground shelter there. I don't know if you know it is still there or not. You know what there is underneath you?
Yes.
There's an underground trench that connects the two against aerial bombing.
Oh my
So
God.
the family could get shelter here if the bombers came. I don't think people know that underneath there is an underground shelter.
Were there heavy bombings here?
No, nothing,
Nothing.
not once.
And what about this statue?
This is Lakshmi.
Lakshmi.
It's written Sri Lakshmi, the goddess of wealth. And it so happened that my grandmother's name was also Lakshmi.
So actually she is your grandmother.
She is my grandmother. Well, worship of wealth. My father was very keen on making money.
So even your wedding party was here?
Oh,
In this garden, lawn?
There were 1,500 guests.
Oh my God.
And there was ballroom dancing there and champagne. And Mr. Jinnah was one of the guests.
How big is the family now?
Well, apart from my parents, we are all alive. We have 4 brothers and a sister. Sister lives in your annex. She has children, grandchildren. We all have children and grandchildren, except my youngest brother, who doesn't have any family. His wife divorced him, and he married a second wife, and they have no children. It's a large family.
Large family. But I think one of the most influential families of Delhi.
Was at one time. My father was, in his time, quite influential. He was the bigger builder of Delhi, knighted by the British and member of the Council of States. Self-made man. He taught himself, educated himself. He's quite a remarkable man.
India had and has very great families like the Birlas, the Tatas, Godreges.
They were industrial. They are much bigger families, money-wise, influence-wise. With us, it was mainly northern India. Okay?
Okay. Thank you very much for your giving us this interview.
I'd be surprised to see if the underground shelter is still there. You probably don't know it is there.